Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. Today is August the 20th, 2026. So I'm trying to help you benefit from my $1 million education. Here, I do have, $1 million education, right? So by creating this educational hack, it's a way to help people quickly learn information, how to think, and how to have useful education, whether it's on American presidents, all American presidents from number 1 to number 47, whether it's to educate Americans on um, US history or laws. This is not legal advice or international human rights law, or to provide guidance, right? Educational guidance on how to go to college, how to go about getting into an Ivy League, or how to get into a law school, or career advice, just given my own background. Another day I'll do a video and explain how I have $1 million education. But today, what I want to do is discuss the Black American community and explain how the Black American community is not homogenous, right? The Black American community in America is not a homogenous group. So again, you can say, well, they're not a monolith, right? And of course, I'm titling this video as Black Americans are not a monolith, right? When I say they're not a monolith, Black Americans are not a monolith, many people consider that, well, I'm probably referring to the new immigrants, right? The new first generation African American, immigrants from Africa, right? Like me, I'm first generation. I'm an American citizen. I'm first generation, or or people born here whose parents came directly from Africa in the 70s or 60s or 80s. I'm not talking about those of African descent. I'm talking about Black Americans who are descendants of African slaves, right? Who have multi-generation African American roots going back all the way to the era of slavery, antebellum years. Antebellum means prior to the Civil War, right? Prior to the Civil War. That's who I'm referring to. And also, I would include in that those not even necessarily in those whose ties to chattel slavery is not restricted to U.S., but also the Caribbeans due to the transatlantic slavery. I'm talking about those who are descendants of African slaves via the Caribbeans or Latin America, who share their heritage from the Caribbeans, whether it's Jamaica. Jamaicans also, Africans and Jamaicans, blacks in Jamaica, are also descendants of slaves, right? Same thing as whether they're blacks from Brazil or other parts as well, other parts of Latin America. According to census data, by the way, just in case you need to know, if you care, the current black population in America, right? If you notice, if you're checking a box, they have all these boxes on racial categories, whether you're filling out a form for housing or for education or loans. Notice there's a equal opportunity form you have to fill out, right? And it has categories. It has white, it has Hispanic, and then black people. All people of African descent are linked together in one category. It says black or people of African descent, right? They're all linked together. They're lumped together, right, in one box. So there's just one box to fill, right? So if you were to break down blacks in America today, a study that I saw says 55%, roughly 50 to 55% of the current black US population is made up of Black Americans, African Americans, who are linked directly to direct descendants of multi-generational descendants of chattel slavery in the US, right? It was 55%. There's another 20% that's linked, that are descendants of slaves, but due to the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Caribbean and in Latin America. Now, there's another group of 10% who are from first generation African migrants, first generation African migrants who are not at all tied to slavery. They're not descendants of slaves. Recent migrants, like me, from Africa, and many more, and those who have children, they constitute about 10%. So this video, when I say black Americans are not a monolith, or they're not homogenous, I'm referring to African Americans, excluding the new African migrants not tied to chattel slavery, who are not descendants of chattel slavery. I'm excluding people like me, right? So, and the children of people like me, I'm excluding them. So the reason I'm doing this is many of us Africans, new African migrants, when we come to America for the first time, when we see African Americans, black Americans, we are enthused, right? We're very enthused to see them, and we think it's someone from back home. I remember when I came in the 90s and I was in Troy, Alabama, and I'd see someone who looked just like me. By the way, in case you didn't know, people from people from Africa, right? They can identify themselves, right? If you're from Nigeria, Nigerians know themselves because there are certain features they have, or Yorubas, there are certain features they share that are pronounced. They might become pronounced. Forget that, yeah, the world has mixed a lot, right? If a Kenyan saw Barack Obama, they wouldn't know he's Kenyan descent, right? Not necessarily. But many cultural groups, they share these physical characteristics that are pronounced, and sometimes they're able to identify it from cognate group, a cognate, person who shares affinity with them. So when I'd come and I'd see people, I think they were Yorubas like me, I'd start speaking Yoruba to them, start greeting them, thinking they were Yorubas, and they'd say, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm from here. I'm American. I don't know. I've never been out of America. So I stopped doing it, not to embarrass myself or not to embarrass, the people I was, I was mistaking to be Yorubas like me. Now, in case you didn't know, the new recent study data says that African Americans, those descended directly from slaves, chattel slavery in America, roughly 60% of them have Nigerian ancestry, right? They're from Nigeria. The ancestors came from the area of Nigeria. Of course, Nigeria being the most populated country in Africa. Nigeria is about a quarter of Africa, right? The African population, especially sub-Saharan Africa, over 220 million people. So that area was very notorious for wars during the era of the slave trade, and so due to a lot of the inter-kingdom rivalries and wars, and of course they were a huge source of slave, right, being transferred through the transatlantic slave trade due to these kingdom rivalries, right? Because they just have so many kingdoms in Africa. They still exist today. So again, I'm focusing on black Americans, right? And by the way, just as a disclaimer, to put this out there, I'm someone who advocates, I believe, in reparations for African Americans, right? When I say reparations for African Americans, I'm not talking about reparations for the 10% of new African migrants or their descendants. No, those African migrants, majority or all of them, think reparations should be paid for descendants of African slaves. That's African Americans. They don't want any reparation check or anything for them, but they empathize. So when they come, they tend to empathize with Black Americans. So having said that, I'm putting, this is not a discussion on reparations. I'm having a discussion on understanding that Black Americans are not a monolith, right? So the new Nigerian migrants, or the new African migrant, comes and he mistakes African Americans as Africans, right? Somebody from their culture. By the way, they're Black Americans are, those descended from chattel slavery. They're also descended from Ghanaians, people from Cote d'Ivoire, people from all over West Africa, Senegal. If you remember the famous movie Roots, Kunta Kinte was supposed to have come from the Gambia, right? So the Gambia, they go on and on. Mali, many different places. As far as even Central Africa, the Congo, Angola, these were descendants. They descended from Africans from these regions of West and Central Africa, mainly West Africans. So African Americans, they were descendants of people of West Africa mainly. That's where the slave trade, that was the source of the main source of the transatlantic slave trade, right? I've done a video before explaining that the first Black American person to own a permanent slave through a civil court litigation was a guy called Johnson, and he was actually from Angola, right? He was an African from Angola. He had been an indentured servant himself, and then eventually when he was free, he also went on to buy African slaves. So I've done a video discussing that. Now, so Black Americans, they're not a monolith. I have a friend who taught me something. She's Black American. She's a descendant of slaves. She's bougie Black, right? She graduated from Brown University, and she would explain to me that only 8% of Black Americans participated in the civil rights movement, right? Only 8% of them. And when I say Black Americans are not a monolith, once the African migrant comes and he initially mistakes the African American as being African like him, and when he finds out that they're not African like him, then of course there's that friction that eventually comes up. It erupts. Eventually, there's that division, and there's a reason why I'm doing this video, because there's so much acrimony on social media, supposedly about friction between Africans and Black Americans, right? Of course, there are many Black Americans who call themselves now ADOS, that's African American descendants of slaves. Some people interpret it as African descendants of slaves, right? That's to distinguish them from the new 10% of African migrants who've just come from Africa, because the slaves, right, the multi-generational slaves also came from Africa, right? But they've established roots in America as descendants of slaves. They're the ones who fought for civil rights legislation. They're the ones who stayed. They're the ones who even helped change the immigration laws, liberalized those immigration laws that now welcomed new Africans and got the opportunities that their ancestors of Black Americans fought for. So, but importantly, again, like I said, they're not a monolith. They're, of course, when you think about all the tropes, all the stereotypes, right, we find many African migrants now start to embrace many of the racial stereotypes about Blacks, right? That, well, they're not educated, even though they're Black Americans who've graduated from PhDs, and Black Americans who are professors, who are presidents of universities. There's one who's actually connected with me on social media, president of Emory University. There's so many, she's a lawyer as well, been a Supreme Court justice in Georgia. There's so many educated Black Americans. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson of the U.S. Supreme Court, double Harvard graduate. Justice Clarence Thomas, also a graduate of Yale Law School, justice on the Supreme Court. But there are many educated Black Americans, right? So again, people need to learn to appreciate the nuance of amongst Black Americans, right? And not just cast them aside, not just dismiss them as well uneducated, because there are many educated ones, or not to dismiss them as being poverty stricken, the mudsills, right? They are the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Remember, the recent Forbes billionaires has about 15 Black Americans on the Forbes list. By the way, I'm putting aside the two that are Nigerians, right? Nigerian immigrants, recent Nigerian immigrants, Adebayo Gulesi, the billionaire, who actually we share an alma mater. We went to the same secondary school, King's College. Of course, I didn't know him. He's much older than me, but he went to my secondary school, King's College, Lagos. And of course, there's Tokpe Awutona. By the way, both of them are Yorubas. So if you want to understand Nigerians, they're both from my tribe, Yorubas, which is interesting, right? Tokpe Awutona is the founder of Calendly, so I'm excluding them. The others are Black Americans, right? Descendants of Black Americans who were enslaved through chattel slavery, right? The institution of chattel slavery. There's Alexander Karp, right? The co-founder and CEO of Palantir Technologies, which has those huge government contracts. His mother is African American, so he's mixed race. Alexander Karp. There's by the way, amongst these billionaires, I once wrote a piece, and there are people who would discount the billionaires, Black billionaires in America, and say, well, they are athletes and entertainers, right? The stereotype of what Blacks tend to dominate, or where they tend to go and find success in America, that they're entertainers and musicians. Nothing wrong with that, right? Michael Jackson was a talented musician. So there's that stereotype that the Black elite in America are athletes and entertainers, right? So they do have those first billionaires who have taken ownership of their art, like Michael Jordan, their art and their physical prowess. Michael Jordan's one of them. LeBron James is one of them. He's a billionaire now. Magic Johnson, ex-basketballer, is a billionaire as well on Forbes. Oprah Winfrey from media on Forbes. So we see, yes, there are those people from entertainment. Beyonce, right, is a billionaire. She's a musician. Her husband, Jay-Z, also a billionaire, a musician. But there are those Black billionaires who have now made money through their brain, not through physical prowess, through their brain, like the Bill Gates. Right? Bill Gates has multiples of what they have, right? Again, there's probably the historical racism associated with that, and white privilege and opportunities that whites have that Blacks just don't have due to racism. I'm not talking about that. But so there are people like I said, Alexander Karp, although he's mixed race, but you have to also understand, because of the one drop rule. So a lot of how we see Black Americans today, a lot of their identity is still linked to rules that developed, that first came about as a result of chattel slavery. So there's that one drop rule, right? The one drop rule that says, well, you have a drop of Black blood, you're Black, right? So Barack Obama, whose mother's white, is viewed as Black American in America, right? He's Black. So the same thing as Alexander Karp, his mother's African American, but he's Black. He's considered Black in America. So he made money through Palantir Technologies, right? There's David Stewart, right? Who's a billionaire. He's not an athlete. He's not an entertainer. He's a Black billionaire. There is Robert Smith, right? Who owns a hedge fund company that invests in technology, right? He's a billionaire. He was once the richest Black man in America. He's a billionaire. Robert Smith is a Black man. He went to an Ivy League, did engineering, I think, undergraduate. So not the typical. He's not the Black elite from the typical entertainment industry. That was a path that was restricted to Black Americans. So I'm doing these videos again to help you understand the history of Blacks in America. And again, I'm focusing right now on that Blacks are not a monolith. So you see they're black billionaires. But yes, is it true that maybe about over 70-60% of black Americans are, you know, are, do not have education like these billionaires do? Yes. Is it correct that over about 60% of black Americans are underpaid, are underemployed, and things like that? Yes, that is correct as well. But again, just to understand the nuance, right? And so understand that not all black Americans think the same way. When I once attended a seminar, a book presentation by Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy, when he was presenting his book, Sell Out, right? Sell Out. And it talks about these distinctions amongst black Americans, right? And while he was giving the presentation, a black American man came, somebody who looked like a gangster. He posed himself like a gangster. And right there, it was at Harvard, the same Harvard, right? Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he wasn't a member of the school because it was, the presentation was open to the community. And he came, started cursing out Randall Kennedy, a fellow black person. You'd think he would be proud that, wow, a black man, black American descendant of slaves like him is a professor at Harvard. He's just published this great book. A lot of distinguished people are coming, but no, he comes to humiliate him and starts to shout, "You're a sellout, you're a sellout, you ain't black." He was telling him, you ain't black, you're a sellout, right? I was right there and I saw it, right? This was almost 20 years ago, right? Almost 20 years ago. I saw it with my own eyes. So you see, there's the group of black Americans who are against black Americans who get an education, right? So you see that phenomenon. So I can now use this as a segue later in another video to talk about crabs in a barrel, right? So there's a phenomenon that my black American friends always tell me about called blacks in a bucket or blacks in a barrel. That's crabs in a barrel, crabs in a bucket, not blacks in a barrel, crabs in a bucket, referring to the black community though. It's a derogatory term, but it's something the black American community uses on itself, saying, well, it's like crabs in a bucket. Anytime a crab wants to rise out of that bucket, right, all the crabs pull it down. They use their fangs or whatever it is, and their claws to pull that crab back. They want to all be on the same level at the bottom, right? So crabs in a bucket. So and this is very interesting, right? While we're distinguishing black Americans, there are a lot of things that I've read on this. There's a woman called she's a professor, I think, Dr. Joy DeGray Leary. I'm just going to refer to her as Leary. She wrote a book. She wrote something on, she's not the original researcher, but she's also expounded on it, on the idea. It's called post-traumatic slave syndrome, PTSS. And people have, critiqued it that this has, elements of racism as well. But she uses it to describe the experience of black Americans, to distinguish them again from new African migrants, right, who haven't suffered the experience of slavery and Jim Crow and racism in America. Because as she tries to also use science, right, so these people who've devised this concept, post-traumatic slave syndrome, they say, well, they say, well, that genes modify, right? Genes modify, and this is true. I was once a biological science major at Columbia University. I didn't graduate with it. I switched majors, but I was exposed to biochemistry, biology. I did courses in that, organic chemistry. So genes modify and adapt. So I read, by the way, I also read extensively on my own on these things. So genes modify. If someone wasn't born genetically with cancer, for instance, but if there was a toxic pollutant, if there was a pollution, an outbreak of, and which exposed that individual, right, to toxic agents, when they were an adult, maybe in their 20s or 30s, then it will modify their genes, right? That has had an impact on them genetically. And so when they have offspring, it's, that offspring is now going to be, they're going to carry that genetic factor, that gene of the expression of that new pollutant, that toxic chemical that their ancestor, their parents, was exposed to as an adult, which didn't come from their ancestry, their genetic ancestry and all that stuff, right? Their lineage or whatever, right? So genes modify. And so these people argue that slavery modified the genes of African Americans, right? And it's expressed in multi-generational post-traumatic syndrome, right? Post-traumatic slave syndrome. There's this intergenerational trauma that exists amongst the Black community, right? So these different ways of viewing how Black Americans are distinct from Africans, the new African migrants, who are just 10% of the Black population in America. So understand, when people are saying, well, Black Americans don't like Africans, it's not all Black Americans. There are Black Americans who like Africans, who want to identify. Something I've been so proud of that I've seen and noticed is my classmates, former colleagues of mine who were Blacks, who graduated from my law school, George Washington University Law School. I see many of them going to South Africa, different parts of Africa. They're wearing African clothes and they're posting, they enjoy, they're able to travel, they're able to afford it, and they see that exposure. There's a guy, is it Jamal White or J.E. White? I can't remember. He's a martial artist. He acts like he's a martial artist anyway. He does movies. He's a Black American, very pumped up guy. Jay White or something like that. I'm going to do another video, a part 2 of this, because this has gotten long, and I'm going to make that correction. But he talked about how when he was in America and he was indifferent and they called him African American, it didn't click, right? He was indifferent. Yeah, Africans are, they're from Africa. Yes, somewhere along the line, his ancestors came from Africa. It made no significant impression on him until he went to Ghana. He went to Ghana, he said, and he saw people like him, and he saw that, wow, this is where he actually comes from, and it's a different it's a visceral reaction, right? And he understands. He said that Black Americans who've never been to Africa, who've never been there, they wouldn't get it until, like him. He said he was like them until he went. He had this visceral experience. But anyway, I'm going to continue this video about the distinctions between within the African American community. So it's not all African Americans who dislike Africans, right? It's not all African Americans who fought in the Black civil rights, who were advocates, who participated in the Black civil rights movement, right? It's not all African Americans who are uneducated. It's not all African Americans who are, poor at the bottom of the social ladder, right? So you have to understand there's nuance amongst African Americans. And I'm going to continue in a subsequent video. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.